I opened the door but didn't invite them in. I stood on the threshold, blocking the entrance. "We need to talk," Bryce said. His voice was hard with no pretense of kindness. "I'm listening," I told him. "Inside, Mom. We're not going to talk in the hallway." "We don't have anything to talk about. Inside. Whatever you have to say, you can say it here." His wife scoffed. "This is ridiculous, Ellie. Stop acting like we're enemies." "You're not enemies," I replied. "Enemies are honest about their hostility. You're worse. You're thieves hiding behind pretty words." Bryce took a step toward me. His face was red with fury. "How dare you, after everything I've done for you?" "Everything you've done for me, Bryce. I have the records. I have the proof. I know exactly how much money you've stolen from me. I know about the fraudulent credit cards. I know about the utility account. I know about everything." He froze. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. "And now," I continued with a calmness that surprised even myself, "you have two options. Either you give me back everything you stole, every cent, or I go to the police and press charges for fraud." "You can't do that," his wife said. "He's your son." "Precisely why it hurts so much," I replied. "Because he is my son. Because I gave him everything and he repaid me by robbing me." Bryce finally found his voice. "You owe me," he shouted. "My whole life I grew up without a father. My whole life I had to watch you work and be tired." "That was your fault. You chose to have me. You chose to stay alone. I didn't ask to be born." His words landed like punches, but they no longer hurt the way they used to, because now I could see them for what they were. Justifications, excuses from someone who knew he had done something unforgivable and was trying to shift the blame. "You're right," I told him. "I chose to have you, and it was the best decision of my life, until it stopped being the best. But that doesn't give you the right to steal from me. That doesn't give you the right to exploit me." "I didn't steal anything. I just took what was owed to me." "Nothing was owed to you, Bryce. I gave you everything you needed when you were a child. Once you became an adult, it was no longer my obligation. And it was definitely not my obligation to give you access to my money without my knowledge." His wife grabbed his arm. "Let's go. It's not worth it. She's already lost." Lost? What an interesting choice of words. As if I were the one who was wrong. As if defending my own money and dignity were madness. They left. Then they walked down the stairs without looking back, and I closed the door, feeling strangely at peace. He told me the banks had confirmed the fraud, that the credit card debt would be canceled, that they were investigating the unauthorized withdrawals, and that I had a solid case if I chose to press criminal charges. I thanked him and hung up. I sat in my empty living room in my house that no longer had a television or fancy furniture, and for the first time in a long time, I felt rich. Rich in something money couldn't buy. Rich in dignity, in strength, in the certainty that I was doing the right thing. The days that followed that confrontation at my door were strangely silent, as if the whole world were holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. I found myself caught in a kind of emotional limbo where rage and pain mixed with a growing sense of liberation that I didn't know how to fully process. Bryce didn't call again. He didn't show up at my door again. And for the first time in years, I wasn't constantly waiting for his contact. I wasn't checking my phone every hour to see if there was a message from him. I wasn't inventing excuses in my mind to justify his absence or his silence. But although he wasn't physically present in my life during those days, his digital presence was impossible to ignore. Something in me led me to check his social media, something I normally wouldn't do, as it always seemed like an invasion of privacy, even for a mother. But now, I felt I had the right to know what he was doing, what he was saying, how he was presenting his life to the world while I dealt with the consequences of his actions in private. What I found took my breath away with its audacity, its absolute disconnection between reality and the image he was projecting outward. He had posted a photo the day after our confrontation, a photo of him and his wife at a fancy restaurant, smiling at the camera with glasses of wine in their hands. The caption said something about celebrating the release of toxic energy and surrounding oneself only with people who add value to life, as if I were the toxicity he needed to liberate himself from. As if my refusal to let myself be robbed further was some kind of negativity he had the wisdom to eliminate from his existence.
The comments below the photo were all positive, all congratulating him for protecting his peace of mind, for setting healthy boundaries, for prioritizing his emotional well-being. I stared at the screen, feeling a mix of disbelief and disgust, because all those people supporting him had no idea that the man they were celebrating had been robbing his own mother for years. There were more posts in the following days, each one more elaborate than the last, as if Bryce were deliberately constructing a public narrative of his life that had absolutely nothing to do with the truth. I knew a photo of him at the gym with a reflection on self-care and the importance of investing in oneself before being able to help others. Words that sounded deep and meaningful until you remembered this was the same man who had used stolen money from his mother to buy gym memberships and expensive sportswear. Another photo of him working on his computer with a comment about the sacrifice and hard work it takes to build a successful future, without mentioning that this future had been partially financed with fraudulent credit cards in my name and utility accounts I was unknowingly paying for. What impacted me most was a post he made that Friday, exactly the day he would normally have come to my house for dinner. A post where he shared an old photo of him and me when he was a child, a photo I didn't even know he had. A photo where I was holding him in my arms when he was perhaps 5 years old and we were both smiling. The text accompanying the photo was something about how sometimes the people you love the most are the ones who hurt you the most, about how he had learned that love doesn't mean tolerating abusive behavior, about how he had made the difficult decision to distance himself from a toxic family relationship for the sake of his mental health. Reading those words, I felt as if someone had punched me in the stomach. Bryce had taken our history, our real relationship with all its complicated and painful nuances, and completely inverted it, presenting himself as the victim and me as the abuser. The comments on that post were even more abundant than the previous ones. Dozens of people expressing their support, telling him how brave he was for setting those boundaries, sharing their own stories of difficult family relationships, completely validating his fabricated version of events. There were people I knew in those comments, neighbors who had known him when he lived with me, co-workers who had come to parties at my house years ago, all of them offering words of encouragement and solidarity, without the slightest idea that the person he supposedly needed to protect himself from was the same woman who had worked 2 jobs for years to give him the education he now used to get his well-paying job. For several days, I watched this digital spectacle in silence, without commenting, without publicly reacting in any way, because something in me knew that this was exactly the game Bryce was playing. If I responded emotionally, I would be falling into his trap, giving him more ammunition for his narrative that I was the unstable, problematic mother he needed to distance himself from. But every new post, every new comment of support he received from people who didn't know the truth was like a small wound opening deep inside me, not because I cared what those people thought of me specifically, but because it hurt to see how easily people believed a well-lied story without questioning if there might be another side to the events. The final straw came when Bryce posted a story on his account showing the house he and his wife had bought, showcasing the renovations they had done, the new furniture they had acquired, the perfectly designed garden, all presented as the fruit of their hard work and dedication. There was not a single mention of the fact that a significant part of all this had been paid for with money that wasn't his, with credit that had been fraudulently obtained using my personal information. He displayed it all with so much pride, so much satisfaction, as if he truly believed he had earned it himself, as if he had completely forgotten or simply didn't care that every brick of that house was partially built on the sacrifice and theft from his own mother. I watched him live his life in those small digital windows and wondered how it was possible for someone to sleep at night knowing what they had done.
How is it possible to maintain that facade of a successful, ethically correct person while simultaneously committing fraud and theft against the person who gave him life? I wondered if he ever felt guilt. If ever, in the middle of one of those fancy dinners in expensive restaurants or during one of those gym workouts, he stopped for a moment and thought about his mother sitting alone in an empty house after having sold her furniture just to be able to eat because her own son had been systematically robbing her for years. But looking at his posts, seeing the ease with which he built and maintained this perfect public image, I came to understand something fundamental about Bryce, something I may have always known on some level, but never wanted to fully admit to myself. And that was that my son had developed the ability to create parallel realities in his mind. In one reality, he could be simultaneously the abandoned son who deserved compensation and the successful man who had built everything himself. In another, he could justify theft as something he was rightfully owed while publicly presenting himself as a victim of family toxicity. It was a form of cognitive dissonance so profound that it almost seemed as if he genuinely believed his own lies, as if he had constructed such an elaborate narrative in his head that the line between truth and fiction had been completely erased. And as I watched all this from the silent distance of my empty house, something inside me hardened even more than it already was. Because seeing Bryce not only steal from me, but also steal my story, completely inverting the roles of victim and perpetrator in his public presentation of events, made me understand that there was no possible redemption here.
There was no conversation I could have with him that would make him see the reality of what he had done. He had chosen his path. He had chosen the lie over the truth. He had chosen image over substance. And I needed to accept that the son I had raised and loved had never really existed in the way I believed, or had been completely replaced by this stranger who could smile for the camera while destroying his mother in private, apparently without feeling any genuine remorse. The moment came one Tuesday afternoon, in a way I hadn't planned, but which in retrospect I realized had been inevitable from the beginning. Because the truth always finds its way to the light, no matter how many layers of lies are piled up trying to keep it buried. I was in Ateen Chong's office reviewing the final case documents where he informed me that the banks had completed their investigations and confirmed a total of $17,000 in fraudulent transactions over a period of 3 years, a sum that took my breath away, not so much because of the number itself, but because of what it represented in terms of planning and premeditation. This hadn't been a mistake or a moment of weakness, but a systematic and deliberate operation of theft that had required constant effort and dedication on Bryce's part. The lawyer explained that, with this evidence, I had more than enough to press criminal charges, but that there was also another option I might want to consider before making that final decision. That option was to send a formal demand letter to Bryce, giving him the opportunity to return the stolen money and compensate for the damages before proceeding with more severe legal action. He told me this was a courtesy many victims of family fraud offered because they understood that no matter how serious the crime, there were still family ties that complicated the situation in ways that didn't apply to cases of fraud committed by strangers. But he also warned me that this courtesy could be seen as weakness by the perpetrator, and that I needed to be prepared for the possibility that Bryce would respond not with gratitude or remorse, but with more manipulation and denial. I thought about it for several minutes, sitting in the lawyer's office, looking at all the documents scattered across the desk that meticulously detailed every fraudulent transaction, every unauthorized account, every lie my son had carefully constructed for years. I realized that a part of me still harbored a small, irrational hope that if Bryce was confronted with the irrefutable evidence of what he had done, maybe something in him would awaken. Maybe he would find some vestige of conscience or remorse, or at least the basic acknowledgement that he had crossed a line that shouldn't have been crossed.
That part of me that was still his mother, despite everything, wanted to give him that opportunity to do the right thing, to correct his mistake, to show that somewhere deep inside him, the person I had raised with so much love and sacrifice still existed. But there was another part of me, stronger and clearer, that knew exactly what Bryce would do with that opportunity. And that part knew he wouldn't take it as an extension of grace, but as a confirmation that I was too weak to truly harm him, that he could continue manipulating and controlling me because at the end of the day, I would always give in because I was his mother, and mothers always forgive, always give another chance, always choose love over justice. That part of me understood that giving him a private warning would only give him time to prepare his defense, to hide more evidence, to build an even more elaborate narrative of victimization that he could use publicly to destroy my credibility before I could act. I told Aaron Chong that I did not want to send a private letter, that I did not want to give Bryce the opportunity to respond in private where he could continue controlling the narrative and manipulating the situation in his favor. Instead, I asked him to prepare the necessary documents to file a formal civil lawsuit that will become a public record, where anyone who wanted to verify the truth could do so, instead of simply believing the version of events Bryce had been so carefully constructing on his social media. The lawyer nodded with what appeared to be a mixture of surprise and respect, because he probably didn't expect a woman my age to make such a direct and ambiguous decision. He told me he would proceed immediately with the preparation of all necessary documents and that Bryce would be officially notified within the next 72 hours. I left that office feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time, something I couldn't initially identify until I realized it was power. The power of having made a decision completely by myself, without consulting anyone, without asking permission, without worrying about how it would make me look to others or whether people would think I was being too hard on my own son. For the first time in decades, I had chosen to protect myself over protecting another person's feelings or reputation, even when that person was my son. And that choice, although painful, filled me with a sense of integrity I had forgotten was possible to feel. The notification reached Bryce on a Thursday morning, as Adi Chung confirmed to me by phone. Although I wasn't there to witness his initial reaction, I could perfectly imagine the moment he opened that official envelope and read the documents detailing every fraudulent transaction, every unauthorized account, every dollar he had stolen, meticulously documented with dates and bank reference numbers that made any denial impossible. I didn't have to wait long to confirm my imagination, because less than 2 hours after receiving the notification, my phone started ringing with an insistence that bordered on desperation, call after call, which I let go to voicemail without answering because I had nothing left to say to Bryce that wasn't already contained in those legal documents. I listened to the voicemails later that night when I finally felt emotionally prepared to do so. And it was fascinating, in a disturbing way, to listen to the progression of his panic through each successive message. The first one still tried to maintain some composure with that controlled voice he used when trying to seem reasonable, telling me this was a terrible misunderstanding, that we needed to talk immediately before things got more out of control. The second message already had a different tone, sharper, more urgent, where he pleaded with me to call him, that this was going to ruin his life, that I should please think about what I was doing before destroying my own son, as if I were the one destroying something, instead of simply revealing the destruction he himself had caused for years. By the fifth message, Bryce was no longer trying to sound reasonable or appeal to my maternal compassion. He had completely devolved into rage and barely veiled threats, telling me I was going to regret this, that he had his own lawyers who would prove I was a senile old woman who didn't know what I was doing, that he was going to fight this with everything he had, and that in the end, I was going to look like the villain in this story. I listened to every message until the end without allowing myself to feel anything more than a kind of clinical curiosity about how a person could transition so quickly from pleading to threatening when they realized their usual manipulation tactics no longer worked.
His post was carefully worded to generate maximum sympathy, without mentioning any specific details of the accusations against him, painting himself as the confused and hurt son who was being dragged through a traumatic legal process by a mother who might be experiencing age-related mental health issues. The response to his post was exactly what he expected, with dozens of comments expressing shock and solidarity, telling him to keep his head up, that the truth would eventually prevail, that they were on his side no matter what. And I watched all this from a distance with a mixture of awe and revulsion at his ability to manipulate the narrative even when faced with documented legal charges. But something had changed in me, because this time his public theater didn't affect me in the same way it had before. This time I knew I had something more powerful than his carefully constructed words, and that something was irrefutable legal documents that couldn't be manipulated with emotional rhetoric or appeals to sympathy. Bryce's real collapse began when his own lawyers reviewed the evidence against him and apparently told him something he didn't want to hear. His social media post suddenly stopped abruptly, and the silence that followed was deafening in its eloquence. Adongwu Chong informed me that Bryce's legal representatives had contacted him, asking about the possibility of reaching an out-of-court settlement, which basically confirmed that they knew he had no real defense against the evidence I had presented, and that his best option was to try to minimize the damage before this proceeded to a public trial where all the dirty details would be revealed in public access documents. That's when the cracks in Bryce's carefully constructed life began to show. Apparently, some of his closest friends had started asking uncomfortable questions after his wife casually mentioned at a social gathering that they were dealing with a complicated family legal problem. Once people started digging a little deeper, they discovered the public lawsuit documents detailing the specific accusations of financial fraud. Mrs. Bertha told me she had heard from other neighbors that Bryce's name was being mentioned in neighborhood conversations in ways that were definitely not flattering. That the people who had once seen him as a successful, educated son now looked at him with suspicion and distrust.
His wife was apparently furious, not necessarily about the moral implications of what Bryce had done, but about the damage to their social reputation. According to rumors that reached my ears through the neighborhood gossip network, there had been considerable fights in their house about how to handle the situation. Bryce tried to call me several more times during those weeks, but I maintained my absolute silence because there was nothing he could say to change the documented facts of what he had done. And my silence was apparently more devastating to him than any angry word I could have said, because it meant I had moved completely from anger to indifference, and that indifference was the final death of any power he once held over me. The final settlement was reached 3 months after I filed the lawsuit, and the terms were exactly what Admiral Chung and I had established as the minimum acceptable. Bryce had no choice but to accept when his own lawyers explained that going to trial would mean not only the complete public revelation of all the fraud details, but also the very real possibility of criminal charges that could result in jail time. He had to return the full $17,000 plus another $5,000 in compensation for damages and injuries, in addition to paying all the fees for cleaning up my credit and my attorney's fees. And all of this had to be paid within a period of 6 months with verifiable monthly payments, where the agreement would automatically be invalidated and criminal charges would proceed without further warning. But beyond the money, which honestly had never been the main point of all this, the agreement included a clause that I had insisted on adding, and which Admiral Chung initially thought was unnecessary, but which for me was absolutely essential. That clause stipulated that Bryce had to issue a public statement acknowledging that he had committed financial fraud against his mother,
and that the accusations in my lawsuit were true and substantiated. He fought that clause more than any other part of the agreement because he knew exactly what it would mean for his carefully cultivated image to publicly admit that everything he had been saying about being a victim of a toxic mother was a lie designed to cover up his own crimes.
The statement appeared on his social media one Tuesday afternoon. It was brief and clearly drafted by his lawyers to minimize the damage as much as possible, within the limits of what the agreement required. But still, the words were there, in black text on a white background, admitting that he had accessed bank accounts without authorization, that he had opened credit cards using another person's information, and that he had committed serious errors in judgment that he deeply regretted. The comments under that post were wild, with people who had previously supported him unconditionally now expressing shock and disappointment, while others, who had apparently suspected something all along, felt validated in their doubts. I watched all that digital drama unfold with the sense of closure that had nothing to do with satisfaction or revenge, but simply with the quiet recognition that the truth had finally been spoken publicly. The first payment arrived in my account exactly on the specified date, and every subsequent payment also arrived punctually, because Bryce knew that a single missed payment would mean consequences he definitely could not afford to face. With that money, I did something he might never have expected me to do. Instead of simply replenishing my savings accounts or using it to replace the furniture I had sold, I bought a plane ticket to a place I had never been before. I had spent 62 years living for other people, for my son, for the illusion of maintaining a family relationship that only existed in my imagination. And now, for the first time in my adult life, I had the freedom and the resources to live exactly as I wanted without having to justify my decisions to anyone. I bought a small house in a coastal town 3 hours from where I had lived all my life, a house with 2 bedrooms and a garden where I could finally plant the flowers I had always wanted but never had time to care for when I worked 2 jobs. The house cost $200,000, which I paid for in cash, using a combination of Bryce's payments and the savings I had managed to protect in my new bank account. When I signed the purchase papers, I felt something I could only describe as a rebirth. Because this house was mine in a way no other place had been mine before, bought with money that had been returned through justice, not earned through endless sacrifice. Bryce tried to contact me one last time after the final payment was made, completely fulfilling the terms of the agreement. This time, I answered the phone because I knew there was nothing left he could take from me or use against me. His voice sounded different, smaller, more humble when he asked if we could ever truly talk, if there would ever be a possibility of some kind of reconciliation. I listened to his question in silence before responding with words I had been preparing in my mind for months. I told him that the son I raised either never truly existed or died somewhere along the way, replaced by someone I didn't know and didn't want to know. I told him that while I wished him peace and growth in his life, that peace and growth would have to happen far away from me because I had closed that door not out of hatred, but out of self-love. There was a long silence after my words, and then a sound that might have been a sob or simply ragged breathing before he hung up without saying anything else. And that was the last time I spoke to Bryce, because some doors, once closed, need to stay closed, not as punishment, but as protection. Now I live in my small house by the sea, and I spend my mornings drinking coffee in my garden, watching the flowers I planted with my own hands grow. There is a peace in this simple life that I never found in all those years of sacrifice and giving, because I finally understood that true love begins with oneself and that no relationship is worth keeping if it requires you to betray your own dignity. Sometimes I see Mrs. Bertha, who comes to visit me every few weeks, bringing gossip from the old neighborhood and news of people we used to know. And she tells me I look different now, lighter, more alive in ways that go beyond the physical. I have a routine now that is entirely mine. I wake up when my body wants to wake up, not when an alarm clock forces me to. I cook meals that I like, not thinking about someone else's preferences. I spend my afternoons reading books I always wanted to read but never had time for. And in the evenings, I sit on my small porch, listening to the distant sound of the waves and feeling a deep gratitude, not for what I have in material terms, but for what I finally understood about my own worth. This is my victory, not in the money recovered or in Bryce's public admission, but in the fact that I recovered myself from decades of conditioning that had taught me a mother's value was measured only by how much she could give and how much she could endure. I learned that saying no is an act of self-love, that setting boundaries is not cruelty, but necessity, and that protecting your peace is not selfishness, but wisdom. And now I live every day as a testament to those lessons learned too late, but not too late to matter.
I closed that door on Bryce, not out of vengeance, but out of dignity. And that distinction makes all the difference. Because it means I won, not by making him my enemy, but simply by refusing to continue being my own victim. Did you like my story? And which city are you listening from? Let's meet in the comments. If you like the story, you can support so I can keep bringing more stories like this. Thank you so much for your sweet support. I'm looking forward to your comments on the story. There's so much more on my channel. Don't forget to subscribe. See you in the next life story. With love and respect.